Hello, and welcome to Archives Alive at the Stonewall National Museum and Archives located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm Dr. Harvey Abrams, and I'll be talking to you today about a vote that took place almost 50 years ago. It was a vote that would have immediate consequences for millions of Americans and greatly impact the lives of future generations. The vote was taken by the Board of Trustees of the American Psychiatric Association. It was to decide on whether to continue considering a particular behavior as a manifestation of mental illness or not. Since over 20 million Americans have been labeled mentally ill based on this behavior, the vote was of monumental importance to them and to others who also had a stake in this issue. They and the media were awaiting the outcome with nervous anticipation. For over 20 years prior, the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, had become by far the largest and most influential professional organization of psychiatrists anywhere in the world. It had established itself as the ultimate authority on every conceivable form of human behavior, from child rearing to depression to sex. Within medicine itself, it had gained respect by creating the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, which systematically listed and categorized all conditions it considered to be mental disorders and therefore under its authority. The first manual came out in 1952 and included 106 distinct diagnoses. A revised edition was published in 1968. What's important to know for our purposes that both of those editions of the DSM listed that one condition on which the vote I am discussing today was focused. As I alluded to earlier, by virtue of it being listed, it effectively and officially branded over 20 million Americans and millions more around the world with the stigma of being mentally ill. The mental illness of which I am speaking, as you might have guessed, is homosexuality. And let me be clear, this is a very big deal. Being labeled as mentally ill or mentally unstable carries consequences. For as soon as it was printed, its inclusion was used to justify a host of discriminatory practices aimed at homosexuals at all segments and levels of society, which included refusing and firing them from jobs in federal and state governments, excluding them from the military, evicting them from their homes, keeping them from gaining custody of their own children, and banning them from admission to professional schools, to name just a few. It is no coincidence that just a few months after publication of the first DSM, that our president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, issued an executive order banning homosexuals, male and female, from working in the federal government in any capacity. It is worth noting that the APA was already aware of well-designed studies that showed conclusively that homosexuals were mentally normal and that homosexuality, rather than being a mental illness, should simply be considered a variant of human sexuality. Several years before the DSM came out, a sex researcher, Alfred Kinsey, created a media firestorm when he published his book based on years of research entitled Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. It became a bestseller despite it being over 800 pages long. Kinsey's report had the effect of pulling back the curtain on sexual practices and exposing the little-known fact that same-sex behavior was much more common than people believed or acknowledged. He interviewed thousands of homosexual men and later thousands of lesbians and concluded that the overwhelming majority of homosexuals showed no signs of mental illness. Dr. Evelyn Hooker, a psychologist from UCLA, published a study comparing homosexual and straight men's performance on standardized tests and concluded there was essentially no difference between gay and straight men in social, professional, and intellectual functioning. And yet, despite the evidence, homosexuality practically became an obsession with psychiatrists who went on media campaigns promoting their books and themselves, appearing in newspaper and magazine articles, and making appearances on television and radio talk shows carrying a message. Homosexuals were mentally ill and were an endangerment to children, society, and themselves. It was their duty, meaning psychiatrists' duty, to cure these unfortunate souls. Their media campaign was so successful that many homosexuals themselves became convinced that they suffered from mental illness and needed psychiatric care. The general public didn't need much convincing, as they had already accepted as fact through years of religious and social messaging that homosexuals were dangerous child molesters and morally degenerates. As a result, psychiatrists, especially those who specialize in psychoanalysis, kept their schedules full of patients consumed with pain, shame, and guilt over urges, desires, and behaviors they couldn't control. For gays and lesbians who were born after Stonewall and who have experienced ever-increasing levels of social acceptance, it can be difficult to understand what it was like living under the threat of psychiatric labeling. The fear of being found out forced most people, like me, into the closet, where we had to live lives of pretend, but were at least protected from the consequences of being homosexual, which, besides being fired from one's job or evicted from one's home, meant being rejected, also protection from forced hospitalization onto a psychiatric ward, where you might be subjected to a smorgasbord of so-called treatments, including application of electroshocks to the brain and genitals, a procedure known as frontal lobotomy, where they sliced into your brain, and in the case of males, injections of female hormones. Even the treatment known as psychoanalysis, where you were expected to talk your way out of homosexuality, which was demeaning and dehumanizing in and of itself, was a panacea compared to the barbaric techniques I just described, and which were still going on at the time the APA was deciding on whether homosexuality was a mental illness or not. The suspense leading up to the APA decision was unimaginable, and I should know, I was there. In 1973, I was a third-year medical student, and I remember sitting in a conference room with my fellow students, trying not to give myself away by looking too anxious or too guilty, while my professors, esteemed experts, stood before us and taught about homosexuality, and with authority taught us that people like me were unhappy, socially maladjusted, potentially dangerous sexual psychopaths who needed to be cured. What they really meant by cured was really to be changed into heterosexuals by any means available, including torture. I knew that I would never have been admitted to medical school in the first place if I had been open about being gay. I was also keenly aware that I would be expelled ignominiously at any time if that ever came to light. The APA's decision to vote on whether to reverse or maintain its stand on homosexuality did not come about overnight. It was the result of years of activism starting in 1970, the year after Stonewall ignited the modern gay civil rights movement, when a rowdy group of gay activists suddenly broke into and disrupted the annual meeting of the APA. They were led by Frank Kameny, who years before had been fired from his job as an astrophysicist working for the federal government. Kameny stormed the stage, grabbed the microphone, and announced to a room full of completely unnerved psychiatrists, "Psychiatry is the enemy incarnate," while a bearded man in a red dress danced around the room, creating pandemonium everywhere he danced. It also included, at a subsequent meeting, a scheduled appearance from Dr. Anonymous, a gay psychiatrist who dressed up in disguise so he wouldn't be identified. He addressed a packed house of psychiatrists who never considered the possibility of a gay psychiatrist, or that they could be homosexuals who are happy and successful as homosexuals. His impassioned speech, which enlightened the psychiatrists present to those facts, made an everlasting impression and no doubt opened the eyes and minds of many of the attendees. For more than 2 years henceforth, numerous meetings were held, during which gay activists and psychiatrists who were in favor of removing homosexuality from the list of mental disorders met with psychiatrists who opposed the change. Both sides presented evidence in support of their positions. By December 1973, both sides had wrapped up their arguments, and the American Psychiatric Association's Board of Trustees held its vote. It announced its decision in a press release, a copy of which I came across during my research here in the archives. It is dated December 15th, 1973, and reads, "The Board of Trustees of the American Psychiatric Association, by a unanimous vote with 2 abstentions, today ruled that homosexuality shall no longer be listed as a mental disorder. In its official nomenclature of mental disorders, APA President Dr. Alfred M. Frieden has announced. The trustees also urged that homosexuals be given all protections now guaranteed to all other citizens." And so it was official. Homosexuality per se was no longer a mental disorder and would no longer be listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. I guess we didn't need to be cured after all. Gay men and women have come a long way since 1973. We even had a gay man running for president, but none of it would have been possible if we carried the label of mental illness. And yet, while the 1973 vote was undoubtedly a watershed moment for gays and lesbians and laid the foundation for many future social, legislative, and judicial decisions, it was not so easily accepted by everyone. I guess that would have been too much to ask. For one, it fueled a rebellion within the APA from psychiatrists who felt the APA's decision went too far and wanted the decision reversed. For another, it mobilized a group of religious leaders who saw the freeing of 20 million Americans from the stigma of mental illness, not as a good thing, but as a serious threat to society. Unsurprisingly, neither of those groups were going to take the decision lying down. And so, in another Archives Alive presentation, I discussed the backlash unleashed by the APA's decision to remove homosexuality from the DSM, based on materials I discovered here in the archives. It is a story that may have started in 1973, but has been ongoing ever since. I invite you to watch. Until then, stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay active. This is Dr. Harvey Abrams speaking to you from the Stonewall National Museum and Archives. Thank you for watching.
You're so good at this. You do such a good job.
It was better. Okay.
You do such a good job. Let's stop the recording.
Thank you.
Oh my